Let's talk.
Giles Brown.
Who Killed Una Lynskey is the true story of murder, vigilante justice, and the Garda heavy gang. It's October 1971. To tell us what happens next is author of Who Killed Una Lynskey. It is Mick Clifford. Good morning to you, Mick.
Hi, Giles.
Good to have you with us. Whereabouts are you this morning, by the way?
I'm in Dublin. I wish I was down the country, but unfortunately I'm stuck in the city.
Oh, well, there you go. Now, it's 1971, it's Ireland. Explain a little bit give me a bit of background first off to the case we're talking about here.
Yeah, Ireland, and I suppose a lot of particularly young people and people who are unfamiliar with Ireland won't realise it because it's a very modern, wealthy country today. But you go back 50 years and it was effectively a backwater of Europe. For instance, it was also a very poor country. The sort of average income per person was just above half of what it was in the UK at the time. It was very much a country dominated by the Catholic Church. Mass attendance was at around 90%. That's weekly mass attendance. Over 95% declared themselves Catholic. And then it was a very agrarian society. It had not evolved hugely since independence in 1921. And into that milieu then, which was effectively an agrarian sort of a backwater, you had the explosion of Northern Ireland. And the civil rights movement, followed by the reaction from unionists to violence, followed by the British Army coming in to quell things, and then the IRA turning on them. All of that exploded, and a certain amount of it spilled over into the Republic. And that, I think, was a crucial issue in the type of policing that ultimately really contributed to this tragedy, which, by the way, had nothing to do with politics, but the type of policing that it would seem was deployed in dealing with the likes of the Provisional IRA was then turned on what you might call suspected ordinary crime, and that is where we came in with the so-called murder squad arriving to solve the disappearance of Una Lynskey from a quiet rural village, Ratoath, which was about 14 miles from Dublin.
Because this is a thing, I mean, if you say Ireland, the Republic, or Northern Ireland in the 70s, you know, as a British person, I will automatically think, okay, well, it's the Troubles, and therefore it affects the whole of, and we see the whole of Ireland and then the whole of the Republic and Northern Ireland through those glasses, through that tint. But it's not the case in this case, because this is as far away as you can get from this. This is a rural community, as you said, that hasn't changed in basically since the 20s. So you're basically in the past 50 years, and the old ways are very set.
Very, very much so. And as you say, I totally understand the same, because I lived abroad myself for years in the UK and USA and Australia, and that image of Ireland, particularly in the 1780s, is there. The reality is in the south to the largest extent, and sometimes people say that we hadn't a clue down here what was going on, to the extent that it was largely untouched. However, there were instances. For example, 1970, the first Garda was murdered in decades by Republican elements. You had bank robberies going on here, particularly through the Provisional IRA for fundraising. You had a few kidnappings. You had the murder of the British ambassador in Dublin in 1976. But in general terms, to the greatest extent, it was untouched down here. But policing was a particular thing, and there was also, it has to be said, an element of paranoia in government about the chance of it spilling over.
And of course, you've got that whole sort of thing with, Ireland is whilst the rest of Europe is enjoying its sort of 60s sexual revolution, it's not exactly happening in the Republic, is it? And so the old school politics and the old school Garda as well, they're not exactly going to be, they're not thinking in a sort of progressive way, you could argue.
You couldn't indeed, as they say, the 60s arrived in Ireland in the 70s. The 60s, yeah, to a large extent, that didn't, but it was nearly like it was a few years behind here. No, it has to be said, the young people who were involved in this thing, they wore their hair long, their jeans flared, they were into music. One of them, Martin, on the day all of this started, he was tuning into Radio Luxembourg, but that was changing organically as the country changed and the old guard died away. But you're right, it was caught in a bit of a time warp even at that point.
So this killing itself, there is a subtext as well, that there is movement. It's a movement of people, isn't it? Or it's strangers coming into a rural community. So again, a lot of our listeners won't be able to understand the nuances here, or won't know. So just explain, if you can, Michael, the sort of background before we speak about the victim herself.
Yeah, and an element there, and it'll resonate with some people in terms of, there's so much in the news these days about immigration into Europe. Well, what happened here was, in the west of Ireland, County Mayo and Galway, for instance, were extraordinarily poor even by Irish standards, and an awful lot of people were in very small holdings that were unviable. You couldn't make a living at them. So the government introduced this body, the Land Commission. It was originally introduced by the British when they were here, but it was put to different uses. But the Land Commission organised a programme that they would bring people from the west to the east, particularly counties Kildare and Meath, which are right beside Dublin, give them 20 acres, set them up with a chance of making a life. Now, there was reaction from some of the people of Meath and Kildare to that, as we see reaction to people coming into, on a national basis, into countries at the moment. So there was some hassle there. They weren't fully accepted. Now, all of that changed over the decades, but that was a kind of an atmosphere. But as a result, you had a very close-knit community. And at the centre of this community we're about to talk about, they were all displaced Westerners. They were known as Westies. So that was very close-knit in that respect.
And so, because so often in these cases we don't think of the victim. I mean, I know the novel, the book is called Who Killed Una Lynskey, but who was Una Lynskey? Because she's not some, if you like, random sort of selected by or some sort of horrible situation that gets out of hand. I mean, there's a reason behind it for her being targeted.
Yeah, Una was, as I say, her family were part of this community. Her parents, and they'd come in the 40s, obviously very poor. They had done very well. They'd started selling fruit and vegetables. They expanded. They owned 100 acres by 1971. Her father, Patrick, they were a close family. They were embedded in the community. They were well liked. They were regarded as being diligent, hard workers. Una herself, she was finished school. She got a job, ironically, in the Land Commission office in Dublin. So she went in there every day. She had a boyfriend, her first serious boyfriend. She had plans like any 19-year-old. She was regarded as a quiet girl, but somebody who was, really sound. And the only reason she was travelling on the particular bus she was, which was fateful, was that her cousin, who was her best friend, was coming from that part of the lane, and she wanted to accompany her in and out of Dublin because she had started a new job. So she was really somebody on the cusp of spreading her wings, 19 years of age, and with vague sort of ideas of getting out of the local community, maybe moving into Dublin, all that kind of thing. So really, her life is about to take off when this tragedy struck.
So give me a timeline of what happens, and if the timeline of the events, and then the arrests, as it were.
Yeah, well, as I say, Una was working in Dublin with her, and herself and her cousin used to get the bus in. Now, Porterstown Lane was the place. It was a lane joining two main roads. One half of that lane was occupied by about 18 houses. The other half had no houses. She walked across the half that had no houses for the simple reason, as I said, she wanted to get the bus at that end to accompany her cousin. Anyway, they came home from work that evening. About 5 to 7, the bus dropped them off. Her cousin Anne Gahan, his family was also displaced from the west, she lived on that road. She said goodbye to Una. Una took off for the lane. Ordinarily would have taken her between 10 and 15 minutes to arrive home. She never arrived home. Her parents, at about 20 past 7, her mother said, "Where's Una?" She sent her younger son up to Anne Gahan's house to see if Una had stayed there. She hadn't. She came back. They tried Una's sister, who was married on the lane. She hadn't stayed there. They went up to Una's boyfriend, who was living 8 miles away, thinking she may have gone there. He wasn't there. At that stage, they alerted the guards and a major search was launched. In effect, at that point, she had disappeared into thin air. Some people thought then, and another feature of the country at the time, abortion was completely illegal, and people who wanted abortion, they went to the UK, which was not unheard of. Some people thought perhaps she'd gone over to the UK, and the authorities in the UK were alerted to keep an eye out for somebody of her description, just in case, just to try and trace her. None of that came to anything. And then 48 hours later, the murder squad. And they were at the centre of that kind of policing I mentioned earlier, Giles, of effectively assaulting suspects in custody.
So the murder squad. Okay, now this is are they regarding themselves as, if you like, a special unit, a creme de la creme. You know, we're the professionals. You know, when you get a group of men in any organisation, it can be policing, military, they tend to we see this with perhaps some of the contractors who were working in Iraq, for example. They big themselves up, and suddenly they in their own eyes, they are, you know, a special unit. They are renegades there, and they don't do things by the book, and that's what makes them so quote unquote special, Mick.
Exactly. They were part of what's called a technical unit. Now, that was the sophisticated end of Garda Síochána. But as I said, in an agrarian society at the time, crime was very low. They didn't have to be that sophisticated. In effect, they were about 10 years behind the likes of the UK or the European mainland police services. So within that technical unit, you know, your obvious technical aspects, fingerprints, forensic, etc. This murder squad was what was called the investigation section of the technical unit. Their only technical skill was, and some of them didn't even train for it, they just acquired it through practice, was getting confessions out of people, taking statements. And as you say, they considered themselves the elite at that. They also considered themselves at the front line in the battle against the IRA, because that was how they dealt with Republican suspects. They brought them in. They knew they hadn't a chance of getting them because the provost would be so forensically astute and what have you. So effectively, and I think there's no dispute about this now, they beat confessions out of people. And here we have them arriving in this scenario, nothing to do with politics, but they're going to use the same methods.
Who are the suspects then? And when is the body discovered?
Yeah, the suspects. Well, what happened was that evening, as I said, it was about 7:00. A strange car was seen in the lane. A Ford Zephyr. I don't remember them now, Giles. They're not even that old. But a Zephyr and Zodiac were two Ford models, I think, that preceded the Ford Granada.
Right. I think it's Z cars, isn't it? They were driving. If you know actually, I never copped. That's where Z cars come from.
I never copped that. Now, and I've been dealing since I read a book about the Zephyr and this. I never copped that Z cars. Yeah. Jesus, that's good. I learned something. Anyway, sorry. It was either a Zodiac or a Zephyr was seen in the lane. A middle-aged man, he was described by about 3 different people. In one instance, one of the locals saw around that time a middle-aged man coming out of the lane, and another man with a woman in the back, a young woman, who, you know, the suspicion would be was Una. The Gardaí discounted those sightings fairly quickly. Now, that would have involved, to follow that would have involved what you might call some dogged police work. Find out who owns Zephyrs in the area, who owns Zodiacs, all that kind of thing. They weren't used to that sort of thing. At the same time, 15 minutes after Una entered the lane, from the other side, 3 local lads who all knew Una, one of them was her neighbour, grew up beside her, they were coming home from work in a Ford Zephyr. And the guards got it into their heads. These are the lads we want. They did it. And what happened afterwards was, rather than following the evidence to lead to a suspect, they built the evidence around those they considered the suspects. Now, when you do that, and you don't have the right suspect, and you're not willing to hold your hands up, the potential is disastrous, and that's what happened.
It's fair to say there's no softly approach, is there? This is violent, this is heavy-handed, and you've got to, well, I mean, miscarriage of justice or whatever, or false accusations are one thing, but this is almost immediately has horrendous results.
It does, because first of all, they go around. For instance, one local who saw the middle-aged man, they had a Garda force-fit guy come into his house and he started doing it up. And one of the guards kept saying to him, "That looks like Dick Donnelly, doesn't it?" Who was one of the 3 young fellas. And your man who knew Dick well, Porrig, he says, that's not Dick. I saw a middle-aged man. Dick is a young fella like myself. Dick was 22 years of age. So obviously, even at that stage, they were honing it. Anyway, they got series of statements where people changed statements under pressure, I'd imagine. They brought the 3 of them into Trim Garda station. 3 of them all give accounts of being assaulted, intimidated, harassed. 2 of them give bits and pieces of confession that really made no sense and that they have always maintained, and I think it's fair to say, was beaten out of them on the basis that this is what the Gardaí wanted to hear. But crucially, even though the Gardaí thought these confessions showed they were guilty, there was nothing there to say where Una was, what had happened to her, if there was a body where it was. Zero. Absolutely nothing.
Motive? I mean, any small things like that, Mike.
Yeah. Motive, for instance, they didn't, for example, suggest anything like sexual assault because that wouldn't have made sense in the context of what was there. Their theory had it that either Dick in the car had hit her accidentally and she died, or the guy gave her a lift and she got into the car and someone hit her, or something happened and they panicked and got rid of the body. It genuinely didn't make sense.
Now, you have small communities. You have family units. We're going back again to sort of 50 years ago. Family is everything. It's, I live sitting to you in southern Spain, Catholic Church, etc. Family is everything. Same applies for rural Ireland. And what happens next is an absolute demonstration of this.
Very much so. So, but then, obviously, the guards have effectively told the Lynskys, these three lads, your neighbours are responsible. Then the Lynskys, and understandable in one sense, they saw nothing happening. There began to be violence between them. They began to paint things outside the houses of one of them in particular, saying murders and showing a noose and all this sort of thing. And understandably, the other side reacted as well. Then what happens? Una's body is found up in the Dublin Mountains. And then and the cause of death couldn't be determined. Within 10 days, the youngest of the three, Marty, who was pretty vulnerable in the scenario that was there, he'd no older brothers to defend him or anything, unlike the other two lads, he was kidnapped in the middle of a fight, taken up the Dublin Mountains and killed by Una's two brothers and her first cousin.
Yeah. Horrendous. I mean, it's mob justice at its worst, but they've been misinformed. They think they're getting blood revenge, don't they?
Exactly, completely. They're under the impression that this lad Marty was responsible for killing Una. And not only that, there was medical evidence subsequently that after death, a wound was inflicted on Marty that the pathologist suggested was an attempt to disembowel him. So it was pretty horrendous. Now, despite all that then, and again you're going back to the times, the two Lynskys and the Gahan were charged with murder. In court, they claimed they left Marty, he was alive when they left him and they only wanted to give him a fright. This, of course, is disputed totally by the medical evidence. Notwithstanding that, the jury found him guilty of manslaughter, not murder. Now, you have to assume that what was in the jury's head was these lads, other than what happened to their sister, would never be in trouble. They were wreaking revenge. It was totally wrong, but they're not guilty of murder. They're guilty of manslaughter, which... if you were talking about natural justice, if you were talking about a particular thing, on one level, perhaps you could understand, if not excuse. However, the massive caveat is this man did not and had nothing to do with the killing of Una Lynskey.
What's the reaction of the murder squad, of the guards to this? They presumably think, well, that's one less we've got to worry about.
Well, no, to be fair to them, I don't think they were that callous, but what was central afterwards is the guards who interviewed the two Lynskys and the Gahan were the same guards who'd been involved in beating up the three lads in custody, and now they were no longer separate. You could say that they were players, and that by right they should have nothing to do with this investigation, yet they were central to the statements that got the lads off, that effectively got them off with a manslaughter conviction rather than murder, and that resulted in 3 years in prison for them. Within a few months, the murder trial of the other two for Una's murder took place, and again, that was manslaughter verdict out of that.
I was going to say, what's the build-up to that trial? Because obviously this has now made massive headlines throughout the Republic, I should imagine, and emotions must be running extremely high.
They were extremely high, but I think locally the whole place was in such shock at the two murders that, there was no... The two Lynskys and Gahan stayed in custody right through until their trial, which, unlike today, took place about 4 or 5 months after the actual killing. And similarly, then the other lads and their trial, roles reversed inside in the court. Those who'd gone in initially seeking justice were now in supporting the defence, and vice versa. They also got convicted of manslaughter. And one of them, Dick, the guy who's driving the car, who'd made no admissions in custody, he was released on appeal. Martin, they were both sentenced to 3 years. Martin Conmee ultimately served 3 years in prison. And you could argue again that if these lads had been guilty of anything to do with Una, that they should have been convicted of murder. But quite obviously the evidence didn't amount to that. So in the jury's mind, did the jury decide, well, perhaps the evidence isn't there, but they must have done something because their friend got killed? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And that kind of psychological impact. No, I'm speculating on that, but I think if you look at it, it's very logical.
So what prompts you, Mick, to look at this particular case? And because you basically said that you've come across documentation about notes which absolutely proves that this is a huge miscarriage of justice.
Yeah, it should be said that Martin Conmey, 35 years later, did have his conviction overturned. He had a miscarriage of justice certificate and he was awarded compensation by the state. But to me, it goes back to the policing element, and that this was the first very serious case in which that murder squad, the nucleus of which formed what were called the Heavy Gang, who got a notorious reputation during the 70s and 80s. This is the first case that they were involved in that really innocent people were targeted. Subsequently, there were a number of cases, but it set a pattern. If they'd been pulled up, if it had been properly investigated, and if it had been accepted that they'd assaulted these lads in custody, would they have been able to continue the way they did for the following 13 or 14 years? And it's a dark chapter in policing, because particularly you had innocent people targeted by the guards, and they followed through on that targeting by deploying tactics that were totally illegal. And
the thing is, I mean, who, as the saying goes, who watches the watchman? Who polices the police? And you can say, oh, well, and there will be a school of thought goes, oh, yeah, but they must have been guilty of something because it's to get in that situation. But what you do with this, especially when you have the situation that is happening up north, is that it becomes this violent society. It becomes a trust of, a distrust of authority, and that you can argue leads to this whole sort of situation which in criminality in the Republic that goes from, a couple of things being smuggled over this, that, and the other to the full scale what we see in Dublin with the heroin and all the bits and pieces and the network that are set up that still continue today between the north and the south, but they've just changed from doing arms to other interesting substances.
Yeah, no, that's very true. And there's no doubt that it did contribute to the rise in crime. That effectively just brought crime up into line with where it was in the rest of Western Europe. And the wealth as well. Becoming a wealthy society, a huge part of that. But there's no doubt that the policing culture that was there, the government turned a blind eye to it because they saw the Gardaí as being the front line in any war against the IRA trying to take over the southern state. And, the judiciary could be argued didn't look too closely at the kind of stuff that was coming before them either. And that is a hugely corrosive effect on democracy. If you're seeing that going on, it definitely is a corrosive effect, and it lessens the idea of democracy and everybody having human rights.
So what do you hope what were your reactions when you first sort of uncovered the private investigation information, the stuff that you the stuff that was missed and ignored? I mean, you must have been shocked and also angry, presumably.
I was, but I first came across it 20 years ago. I was introduced by the private investigator, who is a very colourful character actor. He was straight out of a TV movie. His office, the centrepiece of his office was a big snooker table. And he had two photographs on the wall. One of Pope John Paul and the other the Magnificent Seven led by Yul Brynner.
Oh, well, he's a man after my own heart already, obviously.
and his first case involved this fraudster in Ireland who got people to invest in a Gibraltar-based investment company that was a total fraud. And Billy, the private investigator, wrote a book about it, and inevitably he called it Jibgate. But he was a serious man. He was a very serious man, and he uncovered all of this stuff that contributed to a legal case that allowed Martin Conmey to belatedly bring his case for miscarriage of justice, which they ultimately won. Now, the case is currently the subject of a cold case review by the Gardaí, but we're 53 years down the line. The chances, A, of the perpetrator being alive, and B, of actually uncovering evidence must be a very, very long shot, but they say they're making an effort to do it now anyway.
What do you hope that people are gonna take from who killed Una Lynskey?
Well, I hope they'll take, in a historic sense, that this is the type of policing that went on and to which a blind eye was turned during those times. And the outcome when you do that, when you don't ascribe to proper standards and human rights, whatever society you're in, whatever part of history you're in, whatever the circumstances, when that happens, innocent people are going to get caught up in it. And that is, should be anathema to any kind of a democratic society where everybody is supposed to be regarded equally.
The book is called Who Killed Una Lynskey? It's by Mick Clifford, who was speaking to you today. You can order it online via our own virtual bookstore. If people want to find you online, Mick, where's the best place to go?
Best place, I suppose, is my newspaper, the Irish Examiner, irishexaminer.com. I also do a podcast myself, Giles, and it's imaginatively titled the Mick Clifford Podcast.
Who'd have thunk it? This book is called Who Killed Una Lynskey? Fascinating stuff, Mick. Really happy that you could join us this morning on this show. Mick Clifford, thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks very much for having me, Giles.